Welcome to part 7 of our Anita Sarkeesian vs. Humanity series. Some people have been asking me, why do you care so much about Anita? What damage does she do, really? It seems that they think that it is no big deal if a few video games get censored, since, it's just video games. Today's episode will attempt to answer that question. In part 3, I made a rather provocative statement. I declared that art and porn go hand in hand, and the greatest works of art are created in the mediums where people go to search for porn. Allow me now to expand that statement, and state that the same goes for any so-called cheap thrills. Action, comedy, violence, horror, and so forth. What happens is that every artistic medium starts out containing those things, but in time it starts to take itself more seriously, and the people involved in it start to consider it as high art. They develop a snobbish attitude towards anything that is seen as popular entertainment, and avoid it in the art that they create or consume. They believe that in this way they are making the medium better, but when you study the history of art, you realize that the moment an artistic medium breaks away from a popular entertainment is the moment when it stops being a force that can change the world, and stops producing masterpieces that are remembered centuries later. Why is that the case? Well, I can offer several hypotheses. First, when you distance yourself from entertainment, you are losing touch with the general public. The medium becomes a bubble of aficionados, preaching to the choir, and loses its ability to affect the masses. Secondly, when you restrict your art because you don't want it to appear lowbrow, you are limiting yourself to dealing with only part of human reality, and your art becomes limited as a result. Third, and most importantly, when this happens you begin to work by preconceived rules, instead of letting reality dictate the rules to you. Art is a practice that transcends rationality and logic, expressing the thing that cannot be expressed in words. The artists don't fully know what it is that they are expressing, they just know that it has power. In the early days of the medium, when the artists are not burdened with self-importance, they draw the inspiration from the reality around them, and just create what they feel to be good, without thinking too much about it. And sometimes, they stumble upon something that doesn't just feel good, but generates a sublime experience. Later on, philosophers and critics start asking themselves why this art creates such a strong reaction, and form a new language and a new rationality to describe it. Thus, through interplay between artists and thinkers, new ways of thinking and perceiving the world are being born. But then, when those rational ways to explain the art are born, that's also when the artists begin taking themselves seriously, and they start taking the cues from this rationality instead of drawing it directly from reality and from their own irrational side. And so the interplay is broken, and the art becomes lame. Now, I mentioned that philosophers and critics are those who delve into these popular artworks and articulate the logic behind them. Those are the open-minded philosophers and critics. There is also another brand, philosophers and critics who believe in the myth of high culture and high art as something that stands above popular entertainment. These thinkers rewrite history to make it seem like the great artists working in the beginning of the medium already took themselves seriously, and knew exactly what they were doing. They also perpetuate the myth that the great revolutionary artists were misunderstood by the general public and died poor and unknown, and to prove it they produced quotes from the time that show how disrespected they were. But when you look into the biography of these artists, you realize that they were actually quite popular among the uncultivated masses, and the disparaging quotes all came from the high culture guardians of their time, who dismissed them as no more than popular entertainers. The best example are William Shakespeare's plays, that for 2 centuries were considered little more than popular entertainment, until they were glorified as high art by the thinkers of the late 18th century. By the end of the 19th century, they were held in such high regard that the high culture proponents claimed that they couldn't have possibly been written by a commoner like Shakespeare, and that he must have been just a front for a writer from a more erudite background. Thus, with such revisionism, they can keep on living with their snobbery. When I ask the proponents of high culture to name even one case of such an artist who is considered great today but was unappreciated by the masses in his time and died poor and unrecognized, it's hard for them to come up with an answer. Eventually they usually say, well, what about this guy? Okay, what about this guy? Vincent van Gogh. Yes, that's how you pronounce it. Van Gogh. It's a Flemish name, in the sense that you have to use a lot of phlegm. Van Gogh did indeed die without gaining recognition, but that's for a very simple reason. He never gave himself a chance. All of his masterpieces that are so well known today were painted in the last 2 years of his life, and very few people got to see them before he committed suicide. After his death, though, it took just a few years for his fame to spread. Van Gogh was part of the modern art revolution. In those years, painting was still a popular artistic medium, and many people would go to exhibitions just for the so-called cheap thrills. The high art guardians appreciated paintings for expressing classical themes, which were seen as universal and transcendent, and derided modern art for what they saw as providing only cheap thrills. But some people felt that those modern paintings generate sublime emotions in them, for reasons that they could not explain but could still feel. Slowly, by trying to figure out these emotions, the modernist movement started to find its own logic, creating new ways of thinking that fertilized 20th century culture. In the 1971 song Vincent that we are hearing in the background, Don McLean sings that he finally understands what Van Gogh was trying to say.
Now I understand what you tried to say to me, how you suffered for your sanity, how you tried to set them free. They would not listen, they did not know how. Perhaps they'll listen now.
And this is pretty much where it ended. After about a century in which modern painting created artworks which thrilled and inspired their viewers, producing painters that became cultural heroes, after the 1960s it lost that power. Painting ceased being a popular art form which people experienced for the cheap thrills, so it lost its ability to attack them in their daily lives and challenge their core beliefs. There have been many songs written about modern art painters. Some of them, like Vincent, talk about the profound effect that their paintings had on the singer. There are no such songs written about painters who came along after the 1960s. But there is such a song about Don McLean. The song was born when a young singer called Laurie Lieberman saw McLean perform in 1971. Back then, rock and roll music was still considered by most people to be nothing more than entertainment for youngsters, and Lieberman went to the concert just to have some fun. What she had instead was a profound, shattering experience that shook her world. With the help of songwriters Norman Gimbel and Charles Fox, she then turned her experience into a song that became a #1 hit for Roberta Flack.
Strumming my pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song, telling my whole life with his words, killing me softly with his song.
Killing Me Softly with His Song is a song about the power of great art, a power that you cannot explain in words but only feel. In the second part of the 20th century, people found these experiences mainly in cinema and pop music, the two most important artistic mediums of the century. Of course, most people living in the 20th century did not think that these were the two most important mediums. They saw them as mere entertainment. My main interest as a philosopher is pop music, and I try to articulate the logic of this art form. But I also realize that the existence of people like me means that pop music has lost power, because we can now understand its rationality, explain why it is great art. In the 21st century, the two most important artistic mediums, where people go to find new powerful experiences even if they can't rationally explain why they enjoy it, are the internet video and the video game. The problem is, while this initial stage of the medium is a stage when it produces its greatest masterpieces, it is also the stage when it is most vulnerable to censorship. When it comes to a medium that is already considered high art, the high culture guardians will defend it whenever it is attacked. But with these popular forms, society at large does not yet recognize them as art, but it does recognize that they have power. And at this stage, this power is always perceived by most people as a negative thing. Powerful experiences that cannot be rationally explained scare people, and are seen as appealing to the base urges of humanity. There are always some moral crusaders that call for the censoring of the medium, and they find a sympathetic ear with the public and the authorities. Who knows how many masterpieces were lost to the world because of these moralizers? The problem with many high culture guardians is that they don't just think that they know what great art is, they also think that they know what a perfect society should look like, and how art is going to help us achieve that society. That is why they are so hostile towards the popular mediums, which they perceive as a vulgarizing force that leads us astray from the path towards a perfect society. The most classic example is Plato. In his dialogue The Republic, Plato draws a plan for a perfect society, and at some point the question arises of what role the poets will play in that society. The answer is that some forms of poetry are good and conducive to guiding the citizens' consciousness towards a perfect society, whereas some forms are corrupting their consciousness, so only the former must be allowed while the latter should be banned. Since then, there have been many societies that had that regulatory approach towards art. Art had to prove that it has social value before it could pass censorship. What this approach does to art can best be demonstrated through the story of Soviet Russia. The communist revolution in Russia occurred after several decades in which Russia saw an amazing flourishing of artistic forces, in which it produced some of the world's finest novelists, poets, and playwrights, and its musicians were at the forefront of musical innovation. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Bolshoi dancers revolutionized the art of ballet and made it a breathtaking spectacle, and Russian film directors made important advancements that helped lay the ground for the art of cinema. This revolutionary spirit found its way into politics as well, leading to the Communist Revolution of 1917. But once the communists took power, they decided that they know exactly what good art is, and how it can help form the perfect communist state. From the 1920s on, the number of Russian art pieces which today we remember as masterpieces dwindled into nothing. The process reached its peak when Andrei Zhdanov, the second strongest man in the Communist Party after Stalin at the time, was appointed to direct the Soviet Union's cultural policy in 1946, and proceeded to censor basically every important artist Russia still had, forcing all of them to follow the guidelines of his infamous Zhdanov doctrine. After that, any artistic activity in Russia virtually came to a halt. Zhdanov's name became synonymous with the repression of art by an ideology that tries to impose its rationality on it. Thankfully, we don't live in Soviet Russia, but Zhdanovism exists in the West as well. Every new artistic medium has to go through the process of defeating back sanctimonious critics and moral crusaders that try to get the authorities to censor it. It used to come from the religious circles, but now it comes from feminism. Feminism is now the ideology that believes it is leading us to the perfect society, and presumes to know the correct way in which we should all be creating and consuming art.
Violence against women is a serious global epidemic. Therefore, attempts to address the issue in fictional contexts demands a considerable degree of respect, subtlety, and nuance.
It is not your place as a critic to tell the artist what they should and shouldn't do. When I critique an art piece, I don't tell it what it should do, but try to see what it can tell me. If you want to talk about domestic violence, see if the art can provide new insights on the subject, and use it to formulate new theories. But for that to be effective, the artist should be given free hand to create in the way that feels right to them.
There's a clear difference between replicating something and critiquing it. It's not enough to simply present misery as miserable and exploitation as exploitative. Reproduction is not, in and of itself, a critical commentary.
An art piece has no obligation to serve as social criticism. The artists can choose to do so, and they can choose not to. As a critic, you can use the piece for social criticism, but kindly refrain from rebuking the artist for not doing so themselves. It's not their job.
Now, to be clear, I'm certainly not saying stories seriously examining the issues surrounding domestic or sexual violence are off limits for interactive media. However, if game makers do attempt to address these themes, they need to approach the topic with the subtlety, gravity, and respect that the subject deserves.
They need to approach a subject in a way that generates powerful reactions in the gamer. That is all that is required from an artist. Now, you might ask me, you have admitted that you know almost nothing about video games. How can you be so sure that it is an important artistic medium? Well, the answer is that while I don't play video games myself, I can see what reactions some of them generate in the gamers, and based on my knowledge in art history I can judge that they will one day be considered masterpieces. Right now, no one can explain why this is great art, but one day the rationality and language for it will be created. And because of that, I feel obliged to defend the medium from a moral crusader who wishes to regulate it and tell it what it should and shouldn't do. Especially when the crusader in question is an obvious dilettante who dehumanizes and infantilizes the consumers of the art, who hates men and objectifies women, who denies the differences between the genders and who believes humans are just blank slates that you can mold as you wish. I dread to think what the history of art and culture would have been if it fell in the hands of such people. Add Zhdanovism to the list of regressive feminist tropes that Anita Sarkeesian displays in her work. We are nearing the end of this project. There is one more part left, and then I will be done with her.